All right, guys, what's going on? Welcome back to Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nick are in 2024 Week 1 predictions. Clemson versus Georgia in the lab today. Number 1, Bulldogs hosting another top 15 opponent in Clemson. 14-point favorites, 49.5 is the total. 12 p.m. Eastern Time on ESPN Live from Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta. Looking at the Clemson offense, Nick, obviously the Tigers are significantly undervalued heading into this season. You see it in the spread. You've seen it in predictions in their own conference even. And for good reason. This offense over the last couple of years has certainly, since Trevor Lawrence left, kind of just been a bit of a stagnant unit. They brought in Garrett Riley, enters his second season. The recruiting has been amped up significantly, though, as of late. And, of course, Cade Klubnik, a former number 1 ranked 5-star quarterback, is at the forefront of that. And if they want to win this game, he's going to have to play like one in this respective contest. That's the biggest way to beat an elite opponent, is to have a guy like that who can be a great equalizer. We haven't exactly seen it yet, but at times, this is a player that's shown great abilities when it comes to throwing the football with great arm talent. He can really throw it downfield with precision, arm strength, throwing on the run. He has the mobility there. He makes some good throws versus the blitz. Needs to be consistent in that area, especially against the nickel blitz Georgia likes to unveil at times. Got to be prepared to have your hot routes in sync and, those situations. Again, Nick, if you want to win, you got to play like a 5-star. And they have a guy that, has enough upside, I think, to be able to do that.
When you look at Clemson, I think they are severely undervalued in the grand scheme. This was even before Florida State's loss. I still think they are even after Florida State's loss in Week 0, which shakes up, how Florida State will look to win the conference. A lot of people picked Florida State to win the conference. You and I both took the Tigers here, and we feel pretty good about this team, and a lot of that is because we expect a nice step up from Cade Klubnik. Klubnik hasn't quite hit the ceilings that he is expected to when he was coming out of high school, but he is still a really talented player who is very accurate. A 63% comp rate, nearly 64% last year, is a solid number, plus 2,800 yards passing is good. 19 touchdowns, not bad. 9 picks. That's when it starts to get a little shaky. The interceptions have been an issue at time. Also had 4 rushing touchdowns, not really a big part of his game, but he can do that. Also had a fumble issue last year, especially early in the season. We saw him fumble several times. That ended up costing Clemson in some key games, especially against Duke and against Florida State, who we just previously mentioned. I think Klubnik has all the tools to succeed as a quarterback. Can he find the ability to finally get to that level? I'm not entirely sure if he can do it against a vaunted Georgia defense that should be just as good as they have been under the Kirby Smart era. If he can figure out his game and play at full speed, plus the play calling from Garrett Riley, this offense I think is going to be potentially unstoppable with some of the weapons they finally brought in at wide receiver and some of the recruiting they've done a little bit better. That was a big issue, is that Clemson's kind of lacked weapons the last couple of years, and it seems like they are starting to get to that skill positions a little bit stronger and giving Klubnik some options to throw to.
Right. Clemson as a team that we've been critical at least the last 2 years of how bad they've recruited the offensive side of the ball, but that's recently changed. Antonio Williams, guy only played in a couple of games last year. I think he's going to be, a player that contests for, 100 targets this year. Runs plenty of short routes. Concentration in the tight windows really checks out. He can secure the ball in those windows. Tyler Brown was an unsung hero early on. This is a guy who, is a pure slot option, a speedster that can win deep. They're going to try to get him involved in the short game as much as possible, right? Good quickness on in-breaking routes, dynamic on screens. He had a great game last year against the talented FSU secondary, for example. Jake Brinkstool at tight end, a guy who's very slippery and getting behind defenses. Also a guy who runs a lot of quick routes. They just like to get the ball in his hands as he has some pretty good speed in open field. And then you look at some of those young guys they added. TJ Moore, a 5-star, guy with great hands who can win vertically. Bryant Wesco, a high-end 4-star, had a nice over-the-shoulder touchdown grab in the spring game. Adam Randall, a guy that has route running in terms of separation abilities. And then Troy Stiletto also had 58 targets last year. So all of a sudden they go from being a unit we are highly critical of to one that we're praising, Nick, with their potential. Obviously, I think for this season they're going to showcase lots of growth, but I think if they want to win this game, guys like Wesco and Moore, I know you just arrived in college, you're going to have to show up and make some plays, though, in this ball game.
Wesco and Moore are certainly going to have to make impacts very early on in their college careers. 2 high-level recruits that plug into this offense. I like Antonio Williams a lot, that wide receiver Z. I think Tyler Brown's a really strong player. Adam Randall, one of your more experienced players. Troy Stiletto as well, a pretty experienced player at this moment in time who's hoping to be a big impact on this offense. I think when you look at this team top to bottom, especially in this wide receiver room, they've added enough pieces, in my opinion, to be a stronger unit, plus adding back some solid pieces. Stiletto had 321 yards receiving. Tyler Brown had 531 last year. I think Bringing Stool is an incredible tight end, underrated piece of this offense. I'm excited to see what he looks like this year. I think he's going to be a big key to unlocking this offense's full potential. Nearly 500 yards receiving and 5 scores for him last year. Expect some targets to him early on. I want to see what they can get him involved. I like what they've added here, like what they return here. I think this is a very underrated wide receiving group plus the tight end in the ACC.
Now you look at the Clemson ground attack, they were pretty solid, 174 yards per game on the ground. This is a team 2 years in a row. They've been phenomenal the month of November. Before that, a little bit shaky and uneven. Really 3 years in a row, I think, in the month of November, they've been great. Back in 2021, they played Georgia. They scored 3 points, 23 attempts, only 2 yards rushing. Absolutely nothing. I thought that they would struggle to run the ball, but I thought they would showcase some more creativity and at least try to get to the edge a little bit more. They didn't do anything at all, Nick. They just ran right into a pile, play after play for no reason at all. And, you certainly want to avoid that. You don't have that 1-2 punch this year as Will Shipley departs. Phil Maffa, though, a guy that's certainly going to get involved with, his physicality as a short yardage player at the goal line, too, if they can, find a way to the goal line. Maffa's great, though. I think this is a player who showcased a lot of power last year and very good on counter run plays. He can be very effective quite often. He had an elite game against Notre Dame last year. So I think this is going to be a very good player for them. The problem is he doesn't really have that versatility in terms of, outside being a power back, Nick. You need guys that can make plays in space from your backfield. Jay Haynes, a 3-star, Keith Adams. These are the more talented players that can help out in that regard. So if you can get help from the rest of this group, you might have something cooking in terms of being able to offset maybe the lack of production you'll get from the run game in this contest. And if they can do that, Nick, I'll have a lot more confidence in their abilities because they're not going to be able to run the ball for maybe more than 100 yards in this contest. I think 100 would be a very good number really against an elite Georgia run defense. But if the other guys don't help out, it's going to be a tough day.
Certainly a lot to rely on. Phil Maffa, I think is a great back, nearly 1,000 yards rushing last year, 13 touchdowns for him. But he loses Will Shipley, who was his partner that added that sort of dynamic speed back, that guy that really could cut through the defense and make things tough for the defense and throw them off their game. I think Jay Haynes is not a bad back to have in this backfield, but like you said, against a tough Georgia defense, I think rushing yards are going to be at a premium. We've seen that with a lot of different teams that have struggled to run the ball against Georgia. I think it'll be no difference for Clemson. But if they're going to be able to run the ball in those key situations like 3rd and 4th, 2nd and 6th, some of those intermediate areas where they can just pick up a couple of yards here and there, maybe on first down, get 4 or 5 yards to put yourself in a good position, I think that'll be more than enough to keep them competitive in this game.
And I think just to kind of cap off the Clemson offense, they need to put the ball in Tyler Brown's hands, look to win on the perimeter with Williams, need to create one-on-one matchups for their pass catchers, need to look to get into empty sets at times, lots of screens and tempo early to try and loosen up the D-line, because the interior offensive line, it seems like it might get smoked, and I think this is a respectable unit. Guys like Walker Parks are really good. Marcus Tate's a veteran. Ryan Lynchcomb, these guys can be slotted in at center. They have a great right tackle in Blake Miller, and then Tristan Leah is a seasoned veteran at this point. So this offensive line is kind of middle of the road, Nick, and this interior seems like they might be up against a challenge here. So those keys I just alluded to, they must be a focal point.
They must be a focal point. This interior offensive line is a weaker unit facing, again, another vaunted Georgia defense that will look to dominate against the run and put the run in tough positions. The offensive line's got to hold up, give Klubnik some time to really stand back there and make something happen, and also give some ability for the running back room to pick up a few yards here and there.
Now, looking at the Georgia offense, a unit that certainly has been great the last couple of seasons, Nick, and we've talked about how underrated the offense has been for Georgia because that's all people talk about is the defense, and for good reason, but the offense has been tremendous. This is a team that puts up 40-plus points with ease, it seems. They always have great balance. It's mainly due to a physical rushing attack. This year, we're going to be interested to see what happens with this backfield because Trevor Etienne, I think, is going to have a big season. Typically, you see them just have a fresh group of backs because they rotate so well. But now with a guy like Etienne who's a high-end talent, you might see him get 20 carries a game. Not sure if he's going to play in this one. I anticipate he will. Obviously, there's some disciplinary issues that still need to be worked out with him, Nick. Nothing's been announced this far. So I'm going to assume he's going to play. Roderick Robinson, Branson Robinson, a power back. You have Cash Jones behind him. This backfield is not as deep as in years past. Obviously, it doesn't matter when you're running behind this offensive line, which I'll get to in a second. But what do you make of this rushing attack, Nick? Because it's not like it was easy sledding for them either back in 2021 when they played the Tigers, in terms of running the ball. I mean, they did have 121 yards, but they only had, less than 4 yards per carry, and it certainly wasn't, as emphatic as it usually is for Georgia. So what do you make of this backfield coming into this game? And, of course, the matchup's a tough one.
Yeah, Georgia loses two really talented backs that they had last year, which were certainly key pieces for this offense, Kendall Milton and Dijon Edwards. And now they're going to rely on Trevor Etienne, who they pick up from their rival at Florida. Of course, you discuss the off-field issues. Not going to discuss them at this point in time, but when you look at the rest of the running back room outside of Etienne, you have a bit of question marks here, right? I think Roderick Robinson showed a little bit last year in his limited snaps. He had 2 touchdowns, 196 yards on 24 attempts. Showed a little bit. Cash Jones showed a little bit too as well. He had a touchdown and 161 yards on 22 attempts. So you've seen a little bit out of them. You've seen some here and there appearances, plus they also have another back behind them in Branson Robinson, who's not a bad piece. So there's a lot of potential in these guys, but we haven't really seen them so far. I think it's great when you're playing behind such a strong offensive line, and Georgia, again, has one of the strongest offensive lines in the nation, a unit that's going to hopefully hold up and be very good against what is a phenomenal Clemson defensive line we'll get to in just a little bit. But I really do wonder what this rushing attack is going to look like in Game 1. We've seen them struggle against tougher opponents in the past, and it certainly has been something where it put Clemson behind the 8, or put Georgia behind the 8 ball, that is. I wonder if they'll be able to run as effectively as they hope they can against this Clemson front defense. That's a very strong unit.
Now we look at Carson Beck, a guy who's getting superstar treatment, and for good reason. You've seen it early on. The Auburn game, for example, showcased great poise, a game that they certainly could have lost if he makes a couple of bad plays. He's able to showcase that resilience. A guy who really rips the ball. At 72% completion rating, 3,900 yards. I think the arm talent from Beck is impressive. And that's something I noticed from day one, is the intermediate velocity. The rhythm is just perfect from this guy. Really good pocket presence, always in tune off of play action, throws with great anticipation. Great quarterback here, Nick. Guy's getting first round buzz, Heisman hype. Beck is the real deal. What do you think is in store here? He never really had a bad game last year, even when they lost to Alabama. I wouldn't say that was on his shoulders by any means. Thought he played a very good game. So all signs point to him having a stellar contest here. Only 6 interceptions last year, so a guy that also protects the ball, and most of those came in the first half of the year. So this is a player I think is going to have a very good game. Will he have an elite showing, a 400-yard, 4-touchdown performance? Likely not, but this is a guy that's going to get you 250 and a pair of touchdowns with ease, Nick.
Beck's a solid player that they returned, a really incredibly talented quarterback, one of the nation's best, and for good reasons. He had a really strong first year last year, looked comfortable, didn't make a whole lot of mistakes. That 72% comp rate is an extremely impressive number, nearly 4,000 yards passing, 24 touchdowns, and the 6 interceptions. Got a lot better about protecting the ball later in the season, but was part of a costly turnover against Alabama late in that game, the SEC title game, had some issues there. Overall, though, I think he's an incredibly talented quarterback, good arm, nice field vision, really solid piece, obviously getting a lot of love potential for the Heisman, also for a high-ranking pick in the NFL draft. A lot of people saying he could be the number 1 overall pick come next April. Certainly could be a top 5 pick with how valuable the quarterback is. I think Beck's gonna have a good game here. I think Beck's gonna have a really strong season. I think there's no real worries with him. If you're a Georgia fan, you know what you're gonna get out of him. He's gonna be really consistent, really reliable, and not make those costly mistakes. He's hit his potential, while Cade Klubnik has not hit his potential on the other side. I feel really good about this. If I'm a Georgia fan, I think Beck's gonna be just fine. No mistakes, no worries at all.
And of course, you look at the receiving group they have, an incredibly deep unit here. They don't really have any top-end talents by any means, but they have collectively a strong group. They returned one of their top 5 pass catchers, that being Dominic Lovett, a guy who, didn't showcase the same explosion he had at Missouri in the year prior, but, still a player who has quick feet, a guy that has that speed, who can really win from the slot. Of course, Robert Thomas's departure hurts him a little bit, but not all that much. You have guys like Dylan Bell, who is kind of a Swiss Army knife, who I like. Colby Young is going to be a great transfer from Miami. London Humphreys they picked up from Vanderbilt. Michael Jackson from USC, a guy that might be involved on some quick screens, because they love that jailbreak screen. It's usually for tight ends. With Brock Bowers no longer catching passes, they might look to get him involved. Maybe even Arian Smith, a guy who has elite speed, typically gives you a 40 to 60-yard reception once per year. It's kind of been the theme in his career, as he's usually not able to stay healthy. So that's a threat you got to be aware of, Nick, is Arian Smith downfield. And, Oscar Delp takes over at tight end. I think Benjamin Yurcek from Stanford is going to be a tremendous asset as well in some regard. Great receiving room here, Nick. What do you expect from them here? Because I think it's going to be just, spread the wealth amongst these guys. I think you'll have a couple of different players get 5 targets each. Great receiving room here, though.
That should be the recipe for success, right? Spread the ball out, pass it to your pretty loaded room you got here. Oscar Delp at tight end. I think he's going to be a fine, strong, prototypical tight end. Obviously, losing a guy like Brock Bowers is certainly difficult. A lot of people said Beck threw to Bowers a lot last year. He was a very targeted player. Losing those targets is certainly difficult to overcome. But Bowers dealt with injuries last year, and Georgia was just fine in those games as well. Adding Ben Yurcik from Stanford, phenomenal add, a really strong, prototypical tight end, a really good physical player coming in over Dylan Bell. I think is really solid. Arian Smith, I like his speed. Dominic Lovett, we've seen a lot of good things out of him. I think he's a solid piece. I have no worries at all. This Georgia offense, that is, will be just fine. I really like what they have here. This is a really strong wide receiver with a really strong quarterback.
And now talking about that offensive line, Jared Wilson slots in at center. That's kind of the only blemish here. Amaris Mims departs at right tackle. Xavier Trust, Ernest Green at those two spots. That's the biggest concern I have, Nick, is these offensive tackles. They're good, right? And Green's still a very young player, but I don't think they're phenomenal by any means. And they have a very tough matchup we'll get to in a minute with Clemson. On the interior, Dylan Fairchild, Tate Rutledge, Micah Morris gets involved as well. They're stout on the interior. I don't think Wilson being in at center, a fourth-year player, there's going to be much fall-off with Van Pran's departure. But the tackle spots, Nick, I think if that's one thing you can kind of hammer home with Georgia that might be a weakness, it would be those guys. And the matchup is an incredibly difficult one, so they have to be sound. It never seems to be a big bug for Florida or for Georgia. That is when they're, if they have those weaknesses at tackle. At times last year, though, you've seen them give up some more pressure than was ideal. What are your thoughts on that coming into this game? Do you think it'll be an issue?
I think it's certainly something you want to take a look at. Certainly a left tackle, Ernest Green, a younger player, one of the more inexperienced players on this offensive line. Also, Jamal Merriweather is kind of battling for that left tackle spot. That's a concerning spot, right? The blind side, obviously, you want to have your strong pieces there. Xavier Truss, I feel a little bit better about him at right tackle. I think Truss, has shown that he can be a solid piece on that right side. I don't think you have any really concerns with him. I do worry about the left side, and I think Truss is good at 6'7", 320. He's a bigger guy, can move really well, though. Nice hands as well. While Ernest Green, I think he's a bit of a concern point if he's the guy you're going to start. 6'4", 320. Good enough frame. I worry about him on that blind side a little bit. If Beck gets a little roughed up from behind, gives up some tough, opportunities to a really strong Clemson defensive line, could be an issue. I don't think it's going to be that big of an issue in this game, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on.
And Green wasn't awful last year. The only sack he allowed was in the SEC title game off a pure bull rush from Dallas Turner, so that's not a bad blemish one bit, but they were certainly allowing more pressure than they would like at times. So that's going to be that for the Georgia offense. This is a unit I think, when it comes to the key for them, they're just tough in the middle of the field to cover. Great off play action, a physical ground game. Really need, the ground game really leads the way, and that's what you need to slow down. And, the Clemson defense is a unit led by those high-end pass rushers, T.J. Parker and Peter Woods. I still think Clemson very elite against the run. These are some very young guys that got on the field last year. DeMonte Capehart on the interior, Peyton Page, two senior defensive tackles, Vic Burley, a former five-star who didn't play last year, Trey Williams, another veteran. This is a team that's incredibly stout still on the defensive line, Nick. Maybe not as deep as they were a couple of years ago, but these guys are more than capable of changing this game around on any given Saturday against any opponent.
This is an incredible defensive line that Clemson has here. A really strong unit full of incredibly talented players. Peter Woods and T.J. Parker, two younger players, both true sophomores that have an opportunity to absolutely dominate, especially Woods, a strong player coming out of the state of Alabama. DeMonte Capehart, Peyton Page, incredible players. You listed a bunch of players further down the depth chart. I really like what they have on this defensive line. I mean, this is going to be an elite unit that's got a lot of heat off the edge. They're going to put a lot of pressure. If you want to talk about a potential, issue there, when you mentioned that Green got beat by Dallas Turner off on that left side, I think he could get beat based off his matchup over and over again, potentially, with what they have coming from this edge group that's a really strong unit for Clemson.
Now you look at the middle of their defense. Barrett Carter, obviously a tremendous player with his abilities, and the rest of this linebacking group, I'm pretty confident in their abilities to be enforcers as well. Carter has great athletic ability, so he's an asset in coverage. Wade Woodaz is also a guy that has tremendous versatility. He's been a great run defender for them in the past. He's going to take on more of a full-time role this year. Behind them, a lot of inexperience, and that includes true freshman Sammy Brown, who I would like to think will get involved in some capacity for at least 10 to 20 reps in this game, Nick. Pure assumption there. But he's an elite talent from the state of Georgia. You want to find a way to get him on the field, and I think he can make an impact player too.
This is a really solid linebacking unit that's got some decent pieces as well. You alluded to some of the younger players that could be potentially involved. Barrett Carter, a senior leader on this defense, a guy that's been around for a while, a guy that a guy you can rely on if you're a fan of this unit. 62 total tackles from last year, 9.5 tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks. Good numbers from Carter, quarterback of the defense. Wade Woods as well. is a really solid piece that could be, moved around a little bit. I like what they have, some nice versatility. This is a strong physical linebacking core that's going to be able to enforce, put some nice hits, and play some good coverage.
Now, the secondary for Clemson, a pretty young unit relatively, but they have a lot of great talent here. It's led by two true sophomores, Avion Terrell, his brother, obviously one of the top corners in the NFL, and Khalil Barnes at nickel, Kylan Griffin as well in the back end. You have two veterans, though, R.J. Mickens, Tyler Venables will likely be the other safety spot. And then you also have Jaden Lucas, a third-year guy at corner who really hasn't played too much. He's going to be forced into action now. This is a bit of a weak spot for Clemson just because of the inexperience, Nick, and this is certainly, again, you're not facing the toughest of matchups, but Georgia does a great job of just executing in the passing game with their rhythm, their timing, and these guys they do a good job of getting open, so you're going to have to be able to cover them. You don't want to give up big plays. You're not facing Calvin Johnson by any means, and a lot of these guys will probably go day 3 in the draft, but they can certainly beat you with the ability they run this offense, so they have to be stout, especially if Georgia's running the ball well. You got to be alert for play action and deep shots with some of the speed that they do have.
I do worry about some of the youth and inexperience on this. Even the guys that are, been around the program for a while, haven't played a whole lot. R.J. Mickens, Tyler Venables haven't played a significant amount, but they're both two players that have been in the program for some time. Avion Terrell as well is a really strong player, but he's young, inexperienced. Khalil Barnes also young, both of them true sophomores. Got some good experience last year with young players. Jaden Lucas, a nice guy that's a good veteran at right's cornerback who could be a leader for this unit. It's going to be, interesting matchup. I think there's potential they could get burned if Beck and his wide receivers have the right routes and have a good day, but I think this is a disciplined unit that should be pretty solid against the pass, shouldn't have any bad blunders, but one big mistake could put them behind in a big hole.
Now you look at the Georgia defense. You start with the run defense. This is a team that was top 5 nationally for, I think it was like 4 straight years. Fell down just a tad this season, down to 20th, and they were still great, but there were at times they weren't good. It seemed like week after week, especially in the second half of the year, they were giving up a big run or two. Obviously, early in the year, Auburn really had their number. They would always settle down, though, regardless of what would happen early against, say, Ole Miss, Florida, Missouri. They would settle down, and they would never really get burned that bad. 2 games of 200-plus rushing allowed, though, last year, something they hadn't did in forever. But this is a run defense that, even though they don't have high-end talents, they still have great players. Nazir Stackhouse, Warren Brinson, 2 seniors on the interior. Michael Williams, a guy who really didn't take that step forward this past year like I thought he would as a pass rusher, still a highly important player at DN for them. Jamal Jarrett, Jordan Hall, 2 true sophomores, I think will be a force on the interior. So this is going to be a team that's very hard to run against. I think last year at linebacker, you're kind of transitioning once Dumas Johnson got hurt. CJ Allen had some issues. He's another guy who's a true sophomore. I think is going to be tremendous this year. Smail London, a player who we're also not sure if he'll play this game, assuming he will. And then Jalen Walker, a versatile linebacker, who I think is a tremendous pass rusher for them. So there's a lot of greatness to this Georgia defense once again, Nick. I mean, again, no elite talent, no Jordan Davis or anything like that. But these guys all play ball. They're incredibly big and nasty. They're physical. Running the game, running the ball in this game for Clemson is not going to be ideal. The hope is you can try and get these linebackers out of sync, but after a lot of playing time at the end of the year and a full offseason, it's just not going to happen.
A very strong run defense. The Georgia standard under Kirby Smart, this team has been really good against the run. They weren't as great last year, but still, a top 20 unit, a really strong unit. Michael Williams and Nazir Stackhouse, they both look to have really strong seasons. Disappointed at times from both of them last year. Didn't quite live up to the expectations that you would have thought with those two, but they both are still really strong players that can be involved. Williams did have a decent number of tackles for loss and sacks for being part of this team, while Stackhouse, you want to see more out of him in the backfield, want to see more of him against the run, potentially big step-up season for him. Warren Brinson, another really strong piece. Chaz Chimbliss as well. He's a really good leader. Smail Mondon, a solid player, a really strong, hard-hitting linebacker, a good leader as well, the quarterback of that defense. Obviously, outfield issues are certainly a problem with him, but expecting that he plays, he's still a big difference maker. CJ Allen, a younger player as a true sophomore, one of the rare, younger pieces that gets a lot of consistent playing time on this Georgia defense. He had 41 total tackles as a true freshman last year. Expect him to continue to get better and more comfortable on the field.
You look at a pass defense that's been great for Georgia as well. There's at times, though, where we've been able to kind of pinpoint when the secondary will get exposed. Bryce Young a couple years back, Ohio State when they played C.J. Stroud, felt like they would struggle in those games immensely, and they got throttled, you know what I mean? And they're playing a 5-star quarterback here who has the potential to do that. I'm not saying he's going to, but it's certainly, maybe some areas where you can maybe expose them. Dalen Everett, Julian Humphrey, 2 corners there. Ellis Robinson was, high on 5 stars, likely to get on the field. bit of inexperience at the cornerback position, so I think those are something you got to watch because you also have Daniel Harris, a true sophomore as well. Dan Jackson at safety, he's a pretty good tackler. He's all right in coverage. I think he's a liability at times. Doesn't have the greatest of twitch or athleticism. Malachi Starks, on the other hand, is probably the nation's best at his position. You talk about trying to get Tyler Brown involved. I think Starks is going to be keen on him most of the game. And then the nickelback, Jonel Aguero, looks like he's going to be filling in that position. A guy who's also a former 5-star entering his second year. So a lot of youth in this secondary. Maybe not the biggest concern, but again, Nick, at times this has been a secondary that's been kind of easy to pinpoint the games they're going to struggle in. Don't think they're going to necessarily be awful in this game, but I think there's opportunities to strike for the opponent.
There are certainly opportunities if Klubnik can find the right chances and Riley can find the right chances to hit this team where it does have some weaknesses at times. Malachi Starks, obviously, incredible player, one of the best in the nation there. But when you have Julian Humphrey and Jonel Aguero, who are two younger players that are a little inexperienced, that's certainly concerning if you're a Georgia fan. Dylan Everett as well at left cornerback. He doesn't have the best experience in the world, but he's still a guy that you can plug in and be confident in. This year, he had a decent season last year with 5 pass breakups plus a pick, so expect him to be a solid piece. There is some weaknesses, but again, I'm not entirely concerned. I think it's something that maybe some different opponents could take advantage of later in the season. I'm looking at Texas potentially as a team that could, have a nice advantage against this secondary, but I think this Clemson offense doesn't have quite enough to be that big of a fear as we've seen in the past. But you correctly predicted when you hammered that, Alabama would beat Georgia in the SEC title game a couple of years ago with Bryce Young. You hammered that over and over again, made the point that secondary would be exposed, and they were. I don't think Clemson has the same level of offense to, expose them like that Alabama team did, but it's certainly something where it could get out of hand if Klubnik and Riley are calling the right plays and are in the right rhythm early on.
Now we'll get to the tail of the tape, the team comparisons. Georgia on offense will get 3 nods. Well, I'm going to go ahead and give receiver to Clemson. Maybe a bit of a hot take there. I just think the high-end talent is a little bit more than Georgia is, even though obviously you can consider that either way. D-line, maybe a bit of a hot take. I'm going to give that one to Clemson also. I just think that Woods and Parker, these guys are just very good. I think they have a very underrated interior as well. While Georgia, I'm not as convinced and sold on their pass rushing abilities from, the DN spots. And you look at linebacker, great group for both teams. Going to give the edge to Georgia, though. And I'll give the Tigers the nod in the secondary. Both kind of battling the same thing when it comes to youth and inexperience, but a lot of talent as well. I just saw a lot out of those second-year players last year for Clemson that's got me just incredibly excited for what they can accomplish in their back end. So 3 nods for Clemson on the tail of the tape. Obviously, Georgia fans think they have the edge everywhere, and I think it's certainly a good, consolation to make, Nick, because they might certainly have that.
This is a very strong matchup between two really strong teams. I think you can go either way on some of the ones that you picked for Clemson. Certainly the defensive line is Clemson's advantage. I will make that statement. Wide receiver, a little bit closer, but I think I can see what you're trying to go with. I do like what you're going to say. And same thing for the secondary, although I lean giving it to Georgia just because I think the experience is a little bit better in that secondary. But these are two teams that are a little bit closer than I think people realize in terms of talent. This is a solid matchup between two really nice contending teams.
Looking at the final thoughts and the prediction, and what you just said, Nick, is exactly what, people are kind of undervaluing Clemson. They don't realize this is a team that's still very good, even though they lost a couple of games last year. Every single game was close. They beat Notre Dame, should have beat Florida State. I mean, they could still beat anyone in the country. 14-point line. I think the books are just assuming that Clemson's going to be completely stagnant on offense. They very well might be, but I think Garrett Riley has too much creativity, has too much talent now at his disposal to just, draw a blank here. The offense must avoid that indeed, though. I'm confident in these pass rushers. They'll need opportunities to cook. That includes slowing down a run game that Georgia wants to get going, tackle in space as well, versus that assumed creativity from Clemson. I think this will be a game that's a lot closer than people think. I think Clemson can legitimately win this one outright. I mean, this is college football at the end of the day. I think Dabo has a massive chip on his shoulder. I think the Tigers will cover this one, no doubt. Still have them losing by 7. I think this is going to be a great game, though, Nick. I don't think it's going to be that 10-3 thriller we saw a couple of years ago. That was awful. But I think this will be a low-scoring contest. I think Clemson can win this game. They'll hang in there. Don't see them getting blown out. And if they do, it's obviously going to be a bad way to start the year for Clemson. 28-21 final score for me. You're going with a double-digit victory, but a cover by the Tigers.
I think we learned during week 0 the books were a little bit off with some of their spreads and some of those early matchups. Obviously, underdogs had a great day in week 0, including Georgia Tech, who won outright. But Nevada covered what was a hefty spread. Delaware State covered a hefty spread against Hawaii on the road. And I think, again, you look at this is a hefty spread in favor of Georgia, and I just can't really figure exactly where the 14 points come from. I know it's 11 points. I have, Georgia winning by 11 points, but Clemson's still covering at that point. I think this Clemson team is severely underrated. Dabo's still a big-time coach. He defeated a lot of strong teams, including going toe-to-toe with Nick Saban for a couple of years there. He is still a big-time coach who can get the job done in big-time matchups. He is a coach that knows what he's doing. I think people, because he ignores the portal, some of the recruiting has been weaker in previous years, some of his antics with the media. I think people are forgetting that he's still a legit coach that has won 2 national championships, the same as Kirby Smart, right? I think recency bias is making people forget they have the same number of national championships. They both have 2 national titles. They both have beaten Alabama in the past. They both have beaten Nick Saban in the past, but they also both been beaten by Nick Saban in the past. Kirby Smart's been beaten by Nick Saban more than Dabo was. So I think people are forgetting and not giving Clemson and Dabo enough credit. They're going to hang around with this game, make it annoying for Georgia over and over again before Georgia kind of pulls away later towards the end there, get a field goal to kind of put this one to bed and put this one out of reach. I think they can be very competitive in this game. I like what they have on offense. I really love what they have on defense. I think Clemson's a very strong team in the ACC, while I think Georgia's also a very strong team in the SEC. They'll be able to get the job done in front of what should be a really rowdy and pro-Georgia crowd in a nice, comfortable environment. This is a very exciting matchup, a great matchup on week 1, where it's 2 teams that are national title contenders, in my opinion.
I think this is exactly where Clemson wants to be, significantly undervalued. It allows you to play a little bit looser. I think that's what Klubnik is going to have to do to win this game. I would be, pretty shocked, honestly, if they did, even though I'm very high on Clemson, Nick, and that would absolutely send shockwaves through college football. This will be a great one. Glad it's on 12 o'clock. We don't have to wait at all on Saturday. We get to see this one right out of the gates. It's going to be a great one from Atlanta.
Certainly an upset week 1 by Clemson here shakes the fabric of college football and kind of changes exactly, puts Clemson in the driver's seat immediately to be the number 1 seed in the college football playoff, assuming they hold up their end of the bargain. The schedule is pretty straightforward after this one. And then Georgia, a loss, out of conference to Clemson here could be a tough thing to swallow, considering they got to play Texas and Alabama in the regular season. The pathway could get very difficult for Georgia very early on, even in this expanded playoff. I'm very excited for what could unfold between, 2 of the best coaches in the game, Dabo and Kirby, battling it out, 2 of the nation's best teams, historic rivalry, not too far distance between these 2 schools. This matchup has it all. I cannot wait for it on Saturday.
Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.